To help you create apps that best serve our users, we created these ConnectIQ App Developer Guidelines. These guidelines apply to any development or creation using the ConnectIQ SDK. These guidelines are not an exhaustive set of rules. It may be necessary for us to suspend or remove a potentially harmful app from the ConnectIQ store, even if there is no specific violation of the guidelines. In other words, by providing you with these guidelines, we do not waive any of our rights under applicable law or under the ConnectIQ Developer Agreement, which you should also read. We will go through the following 5 sections: appropriate content and subject matter, performance requirements, promoting and monetizing your app, respecting the rights of others, and enforcement. Let's start with the appropriate content and subject matter. You are ultimately responsible for your app. This includes your app's software and content, your app's description in the ConnectIQ store, the behavior of your app's users, and compliance with laws, regulations, and contracts. Your app should not include content that is unlawful, harmful, obscene, inappropriate, or offensive. We prohibit apps from including, linking to, or encouraging the creation of the following types of content: sexual or obscene content, including pornography and any content or services intended to be sexually gratifying. No bullying, harassment, or abuse. No profanity or defamatory, fraudulent, infringing, or other unlawful content. No spam or advertising-focused content that serves primarily to drive the affiliated traffic to a website, or that has the purpose of serving ads. No gambling. Finally, we reserve the right to reject or remove any app that, in our opinion, creates any risk of liability to Garmin, threatens any type of harm to our users or third parties, or could harm our reputation. This includes, but is not limited to, any content that directly or indirectly violates any of our terms or guidelines. Your app must not threaten the physical safety or well-being of users or anyone else. We reserve the right to reject any app that we believe is unsafe or could, directly or indirectly, cause anyone harm. This includes apps that may create a false sense of security, such as safety awareness apps. Here are some specific issues to avoid. Your app should not encourage or challenge users to act or use the device in a manner that risks physical harm to themselves or others. For example, apps should not challenge users to perform exercises in a manner likely to result in injury, or to drink excessive amounts of alcohol. We prohibit apps that are designed to be used during dangerous activities such as scuba diving, free diving, skydiving, base jumping, and extreme flight sports, even if your app is designed to work with one of Garmin's products that have been designed for those activities. For example, you may create apps that add functionality to a Garmin Descent Series dive watch, but your app should not be intended only for use during a user's dive. We do not allow apps to facilitate or encourage gratuitous violence, human rights violations, domestic violence, child or animal abuse, or similar actions that harm the user or others. Apps should not promote the use of illegal drugs, tobacco, excessive amounts of alcohol, and illegal or dangerous products. We will allow appropriate aviation-themed apps, but in addition to any legally required disclaimers, aviation apps, except watch faces, must include the following disclaimer. Warning: the app is intended only as an in-flight aid and should not be used as the primary information source. If the app contains a barometric altimeter, it will not function in a pressurized aircraft and should not be used in a pressurized aircraft. You are solely responsible for ensuring that your app complies with laws and regulations and includes any legally required disclaimer. We encourage you seek independent legal advice where appropriate, especially if your app relates to regulated activities, including the practice of medicine, law, or financial services. If your app is intended for medical use, you must be prepared to submit documentation from any relevant regulatory agencies, providing the app is cleared for use in your target markets. Otherwise, you must update the app's description to reflect that the app is not intended to be used for the purpose of medical treatment and is intended only for informational purposes. Even if your app has been cleared by a regulatory agency, we reserve the right to accept or reject the app based on these guidelines. If you offer features that allow the publication of user-generated content to the general public or users in your app, you are responsible for moderating the content as necessary to prevent any unlawful, infringing, or inappropriate content. You must have an agreement with end users that prohibits unlawful, harmful, obscene, inappropriate, or offensive content. Maintain a method for users to report any inappropriate content or prohibited content. And publish a DMCA-compliant policy to remove content that infringes the intellectual property rights of third parties. If you fail to moderate your app's user-generated content, we reserve the right to take action to suspend or remove your app, just as if your own content violated these guidelines. Other things we will reject. We do not allow any apps that introduce or exploit security vulnerabilities. You are responsible for screening your apps for malicious software prior to submitting. We prohibit apps from using Garmin devices to mine for cryptocurrency. We prohibit apps that are designed to be used by children under the age of 13. Our users expect a high-quality experience when using Garmin products. These guidelines are intended to help ensure that apps perform to our users' expectations. Your app should do no harm. Apps must not interfere with the use or enjoyment of other apps or features, such as the activity experience, battery life, device performance, etc. Here are some specific issues to avoid. We do not allow apps that damage, disrupt, or access in an unauthorized manner the user's Garmin device, other devices or computers, networks, servers, application programming interfaces, or services. The app should not require changes to the system settings that will adversely affect the performance of other features on the device. For example, requiring users to disconnect a Garmin device from a paired-compatible smartphone. Apps should not cause Garmin products to no longer meet their expected battery life, cause other apps to run more slowly, attempt to access data in an unauthorized manner, or otherwise disrupt the advertised or desired user experience. We do not allow apps to override information previously synced to their Garmin Connect account, where such data fields typically come from the Garmin device itself. We want to maintain the integrity and reliability of data values collected or generated by Garmin devices and software. Apps should not require or encourage the use of a Garmin device in a manner likely to harm the device. For example, apps should not be designed for use during activities that will expose the device to harmful levels of heat or water pressure. Finally, by the time you submit your app, it should be fully completed, tested, and ready for use. You should ensure that your app provides a stable, engaging, and responsive user experience. We are not responsible for providing customer support for your app or fielding complaints. You should clearly explain to your users your support policy and availability. It is your responsibility to follow through on whatever support commitments you make. You may not infringe on any copyright, trademark, patent, trade secret, or any other form of intellectual property. You must own or have a license to use all IP included or used by your app. This includes your app's software and content other than user-generated content, your developer account name, as well as the logos, images, and content that you use to promote your app in the ConnectIQ store. It is your responsibility to ensure intellectual property compliance and non-infringement. Here are some tips, though this is not legal advice. If you are unsure if your use of intellectual property is infringing, check with a lawyer. It is not for us to decide whether your use of a third party's intellectual property may be infringing, properly used under a license, or fair use. It is your responsibility to get permission as necessary from an intellectual property owner before using their material. Get permission in writing, keep a record of the permission, and make sure you're complying with any terms and conditions. Your app may be the perfect complement for someone else's product or brand. That doesn't mean you have the right to use their intellectual property. Be careful before making any mention of a brand or using any logo or name that is not yours. If you have questions about someone's intellectual property, you should ask the intellectual property owner. Don't ask us unless it's Garmin's intellectual property. Garmin maintains a DMCA policy for IP owners to notify Garmin of alleged infringement. In some situations, we may need to remove or suspend your app in accordance with our policy. Garmin's DMCA policy is not a substitute for maintaining your own policy for moderating user-generated content. However, in some cases, we may need to take legal action against your app as the result of infringing user-generated content. You can find the policy and additional details in our terms of use. If your app collects and processes any user data, including any personal data, you must comply with privacy laws and any other applicable laws and regulation, as well as all privacy requirements stated in the ConnectIQ Developer Agreement. Think carefully before collecting and using personal data. It is a best practice, and often a required practice, that you take all steps to minimize the collection, processing, and retention of personal data as much as possible. Publish and make available your own privacy policy or other notice concerning your processing of personal data and how users may contact you to exercise any of their privacy rights. You cannot rely on Garmin's privacy policy, which only describe Garmin's privacy practices. Where appropriate, seek permission from users prior to collecting location data or data that may be considered sensitive. After obtaining permission, use the data only in accordance with that permission. You are responsible for complying with any legal obligations to obtain consent, even if doing so would require you to take steps outside of the ConnectIQ framework for your particular use case. We want users to download, install, and use your app. Promoting your app starts with a strong description in the ConnectIQ store, but it can also include advertising the app in your own channels. We encourage creativity, but you must ensure that you are honest with your users and compete fairly with your fellow ConnectIQ developers. You must not make any inaccurate or misleading statements. The information you provide about your app when submitting it to the App Store should include a complete description of all features and any minimum requirements, limitations, or dependencies. This also applies to any other advertising you do for your app, whether or not on a Garmin digital property, and any content or metadata associated with your app. Specifically, you must use your or your company's real name or an alias that does not impersonate another person or company. Keep your contact information up to date. Avoid claiming any partnership or affiliation with Garmin unless we have given you express permission. Do not claim your app is compatible with any third-party system or protocol if you have not obtained any required certification necessary to support such a compatibility claim. Identify whether your app requires any specific Garmin or third-party hardware or software to operate. For example, if the app's core features do not work without ANT+ sensor, you must disclose that. If a specific feature has a dependency, you must disclose that dependency when advertising that specific feature. You must accurately disclose which Garmin devices support your app. Because Garmin regularly releases new products, we encourage you to keep this list up to date. At minimum, you should avoid falsely claiming that your app works with a certain Garmin device. If your app supports ANT or ANT+ profiles, you must list all profiles your app supports. In addition, where applicable, your app must pass ANT+ certification. You must not perform or encourage any action that creates deceptive reviews or manipulating your app's rating. Specifically, you must not disguise yourself as a user to publish positive reviews of your app or negative reviews of another developer's app. Pay for positive reviews, including by offering users discounts on your products in exchange for a positive review or rating, even if you disclose your material connection to the reviewer, or submit a rating for your own app. Garmin intends to enforce these guidelines by rejecting or removing apps if necessary to stop or prevent violations. Garmin, in its discretion, may choose to contact developers and request changes to apps, but Garmin is not required to provide notice prior to suspending or removing an app. When you submit an app for approval, we expect the app to be ready to meet all of our guidelines. We endeavor to review the app and related documentation as thoroughly and promptly as possible. Please keep in mind that even if an app is approved, we may later discover issues after the review process. If we find an issue with an app, Whether discovered by us or brought to our attention by a user, we endeavor to provide an opportunity for the developer to resubmit with feedback. If the issue presents significant risks to Garmin or our users, we may immediately suspend the ability to download or use the app. We are under no obligation to provide you with any notice or process before taking action. Garmin reserves all rights to take any actions necessary to protect its users, products, brand, reputation, etc. This means that even if we remove an app, we can still exercise all available legal or equitable remedies. Despite our right to enforce these guidelines, we hope to avoid the need to take any action. We want your app to be a success.